The stadium pulsed with energy, thousands of voices blending into a single, electrified hum. Fans filled every seat, their bodies pressed together, their faces glowing with excitement as the stage lights flickered in anticipation. The roar of the crowd was deafening, waves of cheers rolling across the vast space like a sonic tide. At the heart of it all, the stage stood bathed in gold, a masterpiece of flashing lights and towering screens. The anticipation was unbearable, the kind of electric pause that only a performer of Beyoncé's caliber could command. Her name pulsed in bold, radiant letters across the massive LED backdrop, and the moment those lights hit, the stadium nearly shook from the force of the crowd's reaction. A team of security guards lined the perimeter of the stage, their eyes scanning the massive sea of fans. Among them, Marcus Reynolds, a veteran security officer, stood with his arms crossed, surveying the crowd with the trained focus of a man who had seen it all. He had spent over a decade working concerts, handling everything from starstruck fans, trying to sneak backstage to aggressive drunks causing disturbances. But tonight, something felt different. The energy in the air wasn't just excitement. It carried something heavier, something almost too charged. He could feel it in the way. Certain groups in the audience moved, in the flicker of tensions that sometimes surfaced in unexpected places. His job was to be ready for anything, and he had learned to trust his instincts. The lights on stage dimmed, plunging the stadium into a brief but total darkness. A collective breath was drawn across the crowd, and then, boom, the first note blasted through the speakers, sending a tremor through the floor. Golden beams of light shot upward, illuminating the stage as Beyoncé emerged from the shadows. Draped in a shimmering gold bodysuit, she moved with the kind of effortless grace that made the entire venue feel like an extension of her presence. The cheers of the crowd surged to a fever pitch, thousands of hands shooting into the air, signs waving, camera flashes exploding in rapid bursts. She strode forward, lifting the microphone to her lips as the music swelled behind her, launching into the first song of the night. From his position near the stage, Marcus kept his focus on the crowd, scanning for anything out of place. His earpiece buzzed softly with chatter from other security personnel stationed throughout the stadium, routine updates about movement in the aisles, people needing assistance, the usual chaos of a sold-out show. Then, his eyes landed on a group of 3 men in the front row. They stood stiffly among the jumping, screaming fans, their expressions unreadable. They weren't dancing, weren't singing, weren't reacting in any way that fit the energy of the concert. Instead, they exchanged low murmurs, their heads occasionally tilting toward the stage with something between amusement and disdain. Marcus recognized the type immediately. He had encountered them before. Men who came not to celebrate but to challenge, to push buttons, to inject something ugly into a space that wasn't meant for them. One of them, Richard Dalton, a tall man with slicked-back blonde hair and an expensive-looking watch, leaned toward his companion Travis Kent and muttered something under his breath. Travis chuckled, his arms crossed, his posture exuding smugness. Beside him, Logan Pierce, the broadest of the 3, smirked and shook his head as if the entire event was some kind of joke. Marcus couldn't hear what was being said, not over the roar of the music, but he saw enough to know they weren't. Just casual concert-goers. Richard nudged Travis, motioning toward the stage, his expression twisting into something between amusement and disdain. Marcus shifted his stance, keeping his focus trained on them. Beyoncé, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension below her, moved effortlessly across the stage, engaging with fans, reaching out toward the sea of hands that stretched toward her in admiration. She thrived on moments like these, the exchange of energy between herself and the people who had come to see her. The crowd, swept up in the spectacle, surged forward in waves of euphoria. But in that front row, something wrong was happening. Richard cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted something sharp, something ugly. Marcus saw Beyoncé pause for half a second, not long enough for most people to notice, but enough for him to recognize the shift. She had heard it, and so had he. His entire body tensed. The words had been swallowed by the sheer volume of the stadium, but the intent had been clear in Richard's smirk, in the way Travis and Logan exchanged glances before laughing under their breath. Marcus took a step forward. His hand, instinctively, moved toward his earpiece, ready to signal the other security members. But then Beyoncé turned, her gaze locked onto them. The massive stadium, still roaring with sound, seemed to shrink down to just that one space in the front row. The flashing lights, the massive screens, the thousands of bodies pressing together. It all faded into the background for that single, stretched-out moment. Richard's smirk remained, but it was thinner now, as if he wasn't sure whether to lean into the moment or back down. Beyoncé took another step toward the edge of the stage, her posture shifting slightly. She still moved with the fluid grace of a performer in control, but there was something different in the way she held herself now. She had heard him. Marcus's hand hovered over his earpiece, waiting to see what she would do. She tilted her head, slightly, as if measuring the situation, deciding how far she wanted to take it. The band played on behind her, the beat still pulsing, but the energy of the moment had changed. The crowd hadn't noticed yet. They were still dancing, still screaming, still caught up in the magic of the performance. But something was about to happen. Marcus felt it in his gut. Beyoncé raised the microphone to her lips, and in that split second, Marcus knew. This moment was not going to pass unnoticed. The stadium lights pulsed in time with the music, casting flickering gold across the massive crowd. Thousands of bodies swayed to the rhythm, their voices merging into one collective force, their energy a living thing that surged with every beat. The concert had been seamless. Every note, every step, every transition perfected through years of experience. But now, something was wrong. Beyoncé stood at the edge of the stage, her body still poised mid-performance, but her gaze locked onto the front row. The music thundered behind her, the band playing on, but she had stopped moving. She had heard it. Marcus Reynolds, standing near the barricade, didn't have to hear the exact words to know. He had seen Richard Dalton's smirk, the way Travis Kent had laughed, the way Logan Pierce had folded his arms as if daring someone to say something. He had seen their mouths move, seen the sneer on Richard's lips, seen the way their heads tilted toward the stage just enough for their words to be aimed. Beyoncé's posture changed. It wasn't obvious, not to the crowd, not to the fans who were still dancing, still unaware that the atmosphere had shifted. But Marcus saw it. Her shoulders squared just slightly, her chin lifted by the smallest fraction, her fingers tightening around the microphone. The moment stretched. Richard continued, to smirk, his confidence unwavering. He wanted this reaction. He had expected it. Marcus had seen men like him before, the ones who thrived on the feeling of control, the ones who believed their presence alone was enough to disrupt, to stain, to twist something beautiful into something ugly. The beat continued pounding, the bass vibrating through the floor, but Beyoncé wasn't moving. Then she did something no one expected. She took a step closer. Marcus's entire body tensed. He had worked security long enough to know that when an artist broke their routine, when they reacted to the crowd rather than the set list, things could escalate in ways no one planned for. His hand hovered near his earpiece, ready to call in. Backup. Beyoncé lifted the microphone, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. She spoke, her voice smooth, controlled, but sharp enough to pierce through the deafening noise of the stadium. She called him out. She addressed the front row, her words wrapped in something dangerously calm. She asked if he thought he was invisible, if he thought that his words, his venom, would dissolve into the roar of the crowd. She asked if he really believed that he could step into her space, into a place built on love, and inject his poison without consequence. The crowd froze. The shift was immediate. The movement, the dancing, the cheers, all of it stalled as the Audience collectively realized that something different was happening. A murmur rippled outward, thousands of heads turning toward the front row, trying to see what had caused the disruption. Richard's smirk faltered. He hadn't expected this. He had expected Beyoncé to ignore him. He had expected her to push forward, to let his words sink into the moment without retaliation. But now, every eye in the stadium was turning toward him. Travis and Logan shifted uncomfortably, their confidence cracking under the weight of attention. They hadn't come here to be seen. They had come to mock, to disrupt, to poison the air with something that could not be directly traced back to them. But Beyoncé had seen, and now everyone had. The crowd erupted. It wasn't just cheering, it was something bigger, something more powerful, something that surged like a tidal wave. People pointed, people booed, people shouted for security to remove them. The unity of the moment, the very thing that Richard and his friends had sought to taint, turned against them with a force they hadn't expected. Marcus moved. He didn't need to ask what needed to be done. He had been in enough crowds, had handled enough situations to know when someone had crossed the line. He signaled to the security team, his voice firm but steady in his earpiece as he relayed the instructions. They weren't staying. Richard stood, frozen for half a second, then tried to argue. He gestured toward his VIP pass, toward the seat he had paid for, as if money could erase the reality of what had just happened. But Marcus had seen enough men like him before. The money didn't matter. The crowd didn't want him there. Security closed in. 2 guards positioned themselves near the aisle, moving with calm precision, their hands gesturing toward the exit. They weren't going to drag him out, yet. But he was leaving. Richard's smirk had disappeared completely now. Logan muttered, something under his breath, his arms still crossed but his posture noticeably smaller. Travis shook his head, exhaling sharply before shoving his hands into his pockets. The crowd wasn't letting it go. Beyoncé stood still, letting the moment breathe, letting the weight of it settle over the entire stadium. And then, without breaking eye contact, she turned back toward the stage. The music exploded back to life. The crowd roared. The transition was seamless, as if she had absorbed the moment, owned it, and then tossed it aside like it was too insignificant to hold her attention any longer. Marcus watched as Richard and his friends were escorted from the stadium. Their night was over, but the moment, that was just beginning. The thunderous roar of the crowd shook the stadium, waves of sound rolling over the thousands of people packed into the massive venue. The air, once charged with unease, had transformed into something different. Something electric, something unified. The audience had seen what had happened, they had felt it, and now they were making sure everyone knew where they stood. Beyoncé stood tall on the stage, the golden shimmer of her bodysuit reflecting the flashing lights from every direction. She had already turned back to the performance, had already reclaimed the moment, had already made it clear that nothing, no one, would dictate the energy of the night except for her. The music pulsed through the venue once again, the bass vibrating through the floors, the band seamlessly picking up from where they had left off. But despite the return to routine, something was different. Down by the barricade, Marcus Reynolds kept his gaze locked onto the front row, his ears still buzzing with the echoes of the crowd's reaction. His earpiece crackled as another security guard gave an update. Richard Dalton, Travis Kent, and Logan Pierce had been removed from the premises. Marcus exhaled, watching as the crowd continued to move, to sing, to celebrate. But even with the music blasting, even with the stage lights dancing across the venue, he could feel the remnants of what had just unfolded. For the first time in years of working security at concerts, he had witnessed a turning point. This wasn't just an artist ignoring an incident. This wasn't just security escorting out disruptive guests. This was something much bigger. Beyoncé hadn't just shut them down. She had taken the moment, shaped it, and turned it into something more Marcus glanced toward the aisle, catching a glimpse of two other security guards still stationed near the exit where Richard and his friends had been let out. He could only imagine what was happening out there. Angry protests, indignant excuses, maybe even threats to call someone about being removed. But it didn't matter. The stadium had spoken, and now the world was about to hear about it. The viral moment, farther up in the stands just above the pit area, Aaron Mitchell, a 23-year-old college student, sat with his phone still raised, his screen glowing as he scrolled through what he had just recorded. He had caught everything, from Richard's smirk to Beyoncé's reaction, from the shift in energy to the crowd's explosive response. All of it was there. His fingers moved quickly, trimming the clip down to the most important moment. He had done this before, posting concert videos, sharing the best moments, capturing the highlights that fans wanted to see. But this was different. This wasn't just about the music. This was a statement. He added a caption, something simple but powerful. Beyoncé wasn't having it. This is how you shut it down. And then, with one final glance at the stage, he hit post. Within seconds, the notifications started. First, a few retweets, then 100, then thousands. Marcus's radio crackled again. The chatter had changed. Security wasn't just monitoring the crowd anymore. They were monitoring what was happening outside the stadium. Richard's escape. Outside, Richard walked briskly across the parking lot, his phone clenched in his hand, his face twisted in frustration. Travis walked beside him, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets, his head tilted downward as if trying to disappear. Logan trailed slightly behind, silent for the first time all night, his usual arrogance replaced with something more uncertain. They had thought they were in control. They had thought they would get away with it. But instead, they had been escorted. Out like common drunks, their humiliation broadcast not just to a stadium full of people, but to millions watching online. Richard unlocked his phone, expecting a few missed calls or maybe an email from someone important. Instead, his screen was flooded with notifications. His name was trending. The video had already reached hundreds of thousands of people. And the comments? They weren't on his side. The stadium's energy shifts back inside. Marcus walked along the barricade, watching as the audience absorbed the moment and transformed it. Beyoncé had moved on, seamlessly continuing her performance, but the energy of the stadium had changed. People in the pit danced harder. Fans in the stands sang louder. The weight of what had just happened fed into the show itself, elevating it, making it something beyond just another concert. It had become a cultural moment. Marcus had worked hundreds of concerts, had watched artists control a crowd, had seen how music could unify strangers. But never before had he witnessed a moment where a performer took an act of hate and turned it into a declaration of power. His earpiece buzzed again. Another security update. Outside, reporters had already started gathering. The story was spreading. Too fast to contain. Aaron's video explodes online up in the stands. Aaron refreshed his feed. His post had already hit 1 million views. He scrolled through the comments, people praising Beyoncé, condemning Richard, analyzing the way the entire stadium had responded as one. News outlets were already picking it up, adding headlines like, Beyoncé shuts down a racist at her concert. Fans erupt. Crowd turns on disruptive fans. Beyoncé's reaction goes viral. Security escorts out front row offenders after Beyoncé confrontation. Aaron couldn't believe what he was seeing. His simple act of recording a moment had turned into something much bigger. He sat back in his seat, still watching the stage, still soaking in the atmosphere. And then he realized, this wasn't just about Beyoncé anymore. This was about accountability. Marcus takes it all in down at the barricade. Marcus let himself take in the moment. The crowd had made its stance clear. Beyoncé had taken control, and no one would forget what had just happened. The music pulsed through the stadium, louder than before, the entire venue now part of something bigger than the show itself. Marcus knew that by the time he got home, by the time he scrolled through his own phone, he would see the moment everywhere. And he knew, deep down, that this was a moment that mattered. Because this time, the world was watching. The concert continued, but the moment had already transcended the stage. The bass still thumped through the massive stadium speakers, the lights still pulsed in hypnotic patterns, and Beyoncé still moved with effortless command. But for those who had witnessed it, for those who had seen what had just happened, the energy had shifted. Marcus Reynolds remained stationed near the barricade, his eyes sweeping across the front row, ensuring that the momentum of the show wasn't disrupted again. The security team had already cleared Richard Dalton, Travis Kent, and Logan Pierce from the venue, and now the stadium belonged to the true fans. The music surged through the air, the crowd's energy reaching its highest peak yet. What had been an ordinary concert moment had turned into something powerful, something defiant. The audience, feeding off Beyoncé's resilience, danced harder, sang louder, and let the moment propel them forward rather than weigh them down. Marcus checked his earpiece again. The chatter was different now. The focus had shifted away from managing crowd disturbances to something bigger. The story was spreading. Outside the stadium, across social media, into news headlines that had already begun forming before the concert had even ended. Richard's world collapses. Miles away from the stadium, Richard Dalton sat stiffly in the back seat of a black sedan, his phone screen glowing against his tense features. His fingers hovered over the device, scrolling through the endless onslaught of notifications, comments, and headlines that bore his name. The video had already surpassed 5 million views. His name was trending, not just on one platform but across all of them. Every post, every retweet, every comment carried the same message. He was the villain. His mind raced. He wanted to fight back, to argue, to tell the world they had it wrong. But no matter how many times he rewatched the video, no matter how much, he tried to spin it in his head, the reality remained the same. He had been called out by Beyoncé, and no one came back from that. His entire reputation was collapsing in real time. Logan sat beside him in silence, his usual arrogance replaced with something hollow. Travis, in the front seat, stared at his phone with the same expression of disbelief. They had thought they were untouchable. They had thought they could get away with it. They had been wrong. A new headline popped up on Richard's feed. Man in front row heckles Beyoncé, gets publicly humiliated and escorted out. The article listed his name, his full name. Panic settled in his chest. He had never been held accountable before, had never faced consequences beyond mild inconveniences. But this was different. His phone buzzed with a call. It was his boss. He knew what was coming. The stadium's energy transforms back inside. Marcus walked along the edge of the stage, scanning the audience. He could feel the unity now, the strength that had settled into the crowd after witnessing what had happened. People weren't just enjoying the concert anymore. They were part of something bigger. A woman near the barricade held up a sign she had made during the concert. Bold letters scrawled across the poster in thick black marker. "We got your back, Queen." Marcus saw Beyoncé glance toward it, her expression unreadable for a moment, before she gave a small, knowing nod. The crowd erupted again. Up in the stands, Aaron Mitchell, the college student who had captured the original viral video, checked his phone for the 100th time. His post was now one of the biggest trending videos of the night. News outlets were reaching out to him, asking for permission to use the footage. People in the comments were analyzing every second, breaking down the exact moment Beyoncé had heard Richard, the exact second she had turned to face him, the precise tone in her voice when she had shut him down. Some were calling it one of the most iconic concert moments in years. Aaron leaned back in his seat, overwhelmed by how fast it had all happened. He had simply pressed record. And now, the entire world was watching. Beyond the concert, the aftermath grows by the next morning, the fallout had officially begun. News stations had already aired segments about it. Journalists wrote articles dissecting every aspect of the moment. Celebrities reacted, sharing their own opinions on what had gone down. Even those who weren't Beyoncé fans couldn't ignore the impact. Meanwhile, Richard Dalton's job issued a public statement, distancing themselves from him. His company released an official post, clarifying that his views did not reflect their values. His name, his reputation, his career, all of it was unraveling. The reality hit him harder than anything else. There was no way out of this. And he knew. Marcus reflects on the moment, back at the stadium, long after the final encore, after the lights had dimmed and the crowds had dispersed. Marcus stood near the now empty barricade. The air still carried the faint echoes of what had happened, the cheers, the chants, the sheer energy that had filled the space. He had worked hundreds of concerts, but this one would stay with him, not just because of the music, not just because of the performance, but because he had witnessed a shift. Beyoncé had taken a moment that could have soured the entire night and turned it into something unbreakable. The fans had responded, not just with their voices, but with their unity. The world had taken notice, and men like Richard, they had learned that they weren't untouchable anymore. Marcus took one last look at the now empty stadium before turning toward the exit, walking away from the night that would be remembered for years to come.